All right, you guys, let's get to it. Because really, I know you're all here for the demo. If you want to play along, you're going to need just a few things. You're going to need a jelly plate. You're going to need a brayer. You're going to need some paper. Because I guess you could use other things to pull a print, but we're going to use paper. And we're going to be using black. Love a black background. It just changes everything that you put over it. Yes, we're going to be using some paint. I'll talk to you about the paint that I'm using. We're going to be using some ink pads. Talk to you about those ink pads. We're going to be using some stamps. And I don't usually use an acrylic block for stamps, but I am for some of the techniques I'm doing. That's all we need. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 ingredients. All right, so I decided for the first Mixed Media Tuesday, I wanted to go back to basics. And I have shifted a lot over the years to starting my layers with the gel plate rather than with a paintbrush. So I'm just going to go ahead. I'm going to grab a couple colors of paint, and I want to show you just how typically I work. I usually start with 2 colors of paint, and I do that just so I get a little bit of a blend and a mix. It's interesting to me how there are many people out there who will only use the paint from the bottle and they never mix. And I understand that. It's very daunting when you don't know about mixing paint, but a good place to start is with a jelly plate. You're going to pick 2 colors and just put a little bit in a couple places. And because you're only using 2 colors, you don't have to worry that you are going to make that dreaded mud. I always like to tell people that I actually created a paint called Mud Splat so that people would not be so afraid of mud. Because, you know, when we were kids, we loved to play in mud, right? I'm using Paper Artsy. They're chalk fresco acrylics, which means that they're matte in finish. They dry quickly. They come either opaque or translucent or semi. And you can use any kind of marker or pen to write over them. And once they dry to the touch, they are dry. If you use it in a book, you will never, ever, ever have a problem with your pages sticking together. So I'm just rolling out the paint. In doing so, I mix the colors, and I'm going to lay down my black paper. It is just traditional cardstock. It's nothing special. You don't need anything special. And I'm going to just burnish it with my hand, and I'm going to pull up. And this is what I get. And I just want you to note that I don't often clean my plate. So my favorite part is that little bit of pink, soft pink that appeared there. Now, I want to make mention of a couple things. I want you to always have an extra piece of paper near you so that when your brayer has been used, you can just go ahead and you can just start an extra piece. I always do this. Sometimes I do it in my journal rather than on a piece of paper. I don't want to waste anything. And you may have noticed that I did pretty well with not putting too much paint on the gel plate. I tend to be, as many people, heavy pourers, and when you are, you end up wasting paint. And in fact, if there's too much paint on there, it just kind of gets sort of globby. And globby is sometimes good, but not always. And you can see the variability I get because I use 2 colors. And that's really what I'm going for. I like to start my first layer with opaque paint. It will give good coverage to what's underneath it. And I also like it to be pretty consistent, but not full on consistent. Now, let's just say I want to add another layer. And if you all know me, you know, of course I'm going to add another layer. Never in a million, thousand, gazillion years would I stop there. So what am I going to do? I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stick with some opaque paints. And I'm going to add tundra and glacier ice. So do I know exactly what color this is going to be? No. I have a kind of an idea, but the exciting thing about mixed media is that it almost doesn't matter, especially at the early layers. You can use any colors because you're just going to keep covering them. So if there's any point in time at all that you have a layer that you hate, the last thing you want to do is get frustrated. It's just a layer that's going to be sandwiched into another layer, and that may in the end be your most favorite peak. I am going to go ahead, and this time I'm going to do it a little differently. Instead of laying this on and burnishing the whole thing, I'm going to do what I call kissing. I'm going to kiss it, which means I'm just going to lay it down a little bit, and I'm going to do a little bit of a swipe. I'm going to move it around, do a little bit of a swipe. Maybe just a little bit more right there. So in doing so, I have opaque over opaque. It's really important that you understand if your paint is opaque or translucent, because if it's opaque and I pulled that print fully, I would have absolutely covered everything underneath. And the key to the layering, one layer away from magic, is that you never fully cover what's underneath. Now I got this, which I could pull another print or let it dry, but I think I'll pull another print. If I let it dry, it just means I am going to pull it up with whatever next layer comes. I'm going to pull another print, and this is where the black begins to really show its magic. There's still some left there. Remember, I got this on my brayer, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to brayer it out on this. I'm going to do it a little bit differently. I'm going to kind of do it like a kiss again. You can go very heavy-handed or you can go nice and soft. And if you just skip over a little bit, and you go nice and soft, you get a very different effect than when you go heavy, heavy. Of course, as it dries, you're able to go heavier. And let's just add that. These are not going to stick together because I'm using the Paper Artsy paint. And now I'm going to go back to this. Now I am shortchanging this, guys, because we're demoing, and I do want to show you as many techniques as possible, but know that when I'm working in my own pieces, I would continue layering here. I would just keep layering. So I'm going to do that one more time. I'm going to layer with Niagara Falls, which is going to have the same tones that are there already. And I am going to add some heavy cream, which is my favorite white paint. I also often pull prints using printer paper. And not because it's called printer paper, but because it's inexpensive. It works really well for collage. And I'm only going to pull prints on heavier weight paper for me when I want to use that as a background. Usually for my collage material, I want something lighter, cardstock or paperweight. All right, so what am I going to do? Am I going to pull the full print? No, I'm not going to pull the full print. I'm going to do some kissing. And the kissing is where I just lay it out, give it some really soft burnishing, and add those layers. Now, what is interesting here is I can make some choices. I could keep that black around the edge and frame it out, or I can begin to be aware that I want to integrate that black into the piece. And I'm going to be very conscious of where I press when I pull the print. Most of the time, I don't really think about being too conscious. I don't know, was that like saying double no? And I just pull, but sometimes you actually do have to think. One of the reasons why I like the measurements of what I'm using a 6x6" jelly plate with a 7" by 7" piece of black cardstock, is because I can pull like that and get that permanent frame, or I can work that frame. And very often what I do is do 2 or 3 layers first, and then I begin to pull a little bit off the plate on the black edge. And the reason why I do that is because I love a frame. I always talk about the notion that when we have art, we put it on the walls, we frame it. It tells the viewer, this is important. look inside me. It guides the viewer. I love the contrast of a different edge or frame around things. So if I leave the black, have it overhang for at least a few pulls, then when I start pulling, it's always going to have a different look than the middle. And I think that's really cool. All right, so I got all that stuff there, which is great. And now I'm going to shift gears. First thing I'm going to do before I fully shift gears is I'm going to get my brayer out, which still is a little bit wet. You know, normally when I'm doing this, I'm not talking. So I would brayer these other pieces right away and get more. But I get what I get. That's good. And I am going to continue to use acrylic paint, but this time I'm going to use translucent paint. Okay. So I want you to notice not only am I using paints that are translucent in the later layers, but I am going from very, very muted to just much brighter. I love that contrast. And for me, it's always about contrast. So the layers that are muted eventually get contrasted with layers that are brighter. Darker, lighter, matte, shiny. That contrast is really good. And you're making these sandwiches when you create, where you're putting things in between other things. And who doesn't like a good sandwich? Doing that, I'm going to start squeezing out some of the paint. So I'm going to go again from this very opaque, muted tone to a little bit of bright. This has a little bit of warmth, but is mostly cool tones. Now I'm going to add some warm tones, and we're going to see what that does. So I'm going to go with some rusty. So I'm going to put some rusty. Remember, this is translucent. I'm going to put some rusty, and I'm just going to shift it up just a bit by adding kiwi gold. All these colors, by the by, are my own colors, if you weren't aware of that. I work with Paper Artsy on stamps and paints, and these are available in lots of places, but they also are available in my shop at sethapter.com. I feel obligated to do some self-promotion, some shameless self-promotion. And, you know, if you guys want these, you're more than welcome to get them from my shop, but they're sold elsewhere as well. All right, so I'm spreading out the translucent paints. And what I love about these is that these are going to give coverage. They're going to shift the color, but they're not going to cover any of the background or design. They're going to add depth and shadow. And again, I'm going with kind of a soft kiss. So you see what happens there. They add this lovely shift in tone, but they do not cover what's underneath. A lot of times when people do have challenges with paint, for example, stenciling, if you stencil with a translucent paint, you're not going to get a very strong image. If you stencil with an opaque paint, you are. So sometimes you think you're doing something wrong, and it's just maybe not fully knowing the material. All right, we have our extra on the brayer. So we're gonna pull it off a little bit, and I just want you to see instantly what it does is it warms this up. And I think I'm just going to use a little bit of smoked paprika on its own. And this is obviously brighter than what we've been using, so this is going to add some brights. So that you can see how it just begins to add some depth. And that's really what this is about, these early layers. It's about adding some depth and interest to these. You know what? I think I'm going to add more right from the brayer. I know it's pretty dry, so we're not going to overload it. But I like where this is going, I really do. And I think I want to add a few more layers of translucent paints. Let's go with some Toffee Apple and Purple Majesty. All right, let's add a little bit of that and a little bit of Purple Majesty. Mostly I do use two paints at once, but not always. All right, so again, I'm going to do that kissing technique. I don't want to obliterate what's underneath. And I wouldn't with a translucent, but I also don't want to just have a solid block of this new tone. I want it so it begins to add some interest and some contrast and some depth. And I want to remind everybody that if at any point in time, this is so important, it's the basis for everything I do, you get frustrated. That's just part of the process. You have layers that don't look good. And all that means is you're not done yet. Nothing says your piece has to look good until you're done. Even then, maybe not. I always talk about more is more. There's no shortchanging layer making, but you might notice that I didn't just slap it on, do that, and pull it up. It's more is more, little by little. So I just go nice and slowly, and I look to see what the layer needs. I'm feeling now it needs a little bit of olive. And I've started to, because I put some of the kiwi gold, which is yellow and translucent, over some of the blues, I've gotten some color mixing, and there's a little bit of a green tint. So I'm listening to the layers, and I'm going to even provide a little bit more of the green tint. This is how I decide where to go. I don't know when I start what I'm going to do. I never know what it's going to look like. I do one layer. I look at that layer and I decide what needs to be next, what the layer is telling me. And I just work until I feel like intuitively I'm ready to move to either another material or another color. Again, I'm just kissing. I'm going nice and slow here. And just pulling up and repeating. All right, you know what? I think we're going to say, let's move on from the paint to the next step. And the next step is continuing to use the jelly plate. But instead of using paints, I am going to use the dye sprays. They are dye-based ink. If you've never used dye-based ink in a spray, you have probably used it in an ink pad, because, by way of education, Tim Holtz's Distress ink pads are dye-based. So all the amazing properties that you get with a Distress ink pad, you also get from the spray. So that's kind of a quick education. They're translucent, pretty translucent. They dry fast. They're water soluble. They're not permanent. That bothers some people. It doesn't bother me, because even though I work in layers, I don't always care that my things kind of smush around. No issue with that. The dye sprays are matte finished. That's one of the things that makes them a little bit unique from any sprays. I also have metallic. All right, so if you've never used spray ink on the gel plate, prepare to be amazed. I am going to get back to this piece, which I'm just going to linger for a second just to give you a sense of what it looks like. But I am going to show you the dye sprays on just a piece of white cardstock. All right, so I have a piece of white cardstock. This is a 6 by 6 inch gel plate. This is 7 by 7, just to get and start with a little bit of a frame. There are really 1,000 different ways to use the sprays, and some of them are on the gel plate. And there are two major ways to use them, general ways. The first is to hold the spray bottle pretty high. You don't have to shake the non-metallic ones. You're just going to spritz so that it kind of floats down nice and softly. I think you probably saw that. I'm going to use, again, multiple colors. That's Rusty Saffron, which is sort of a dirty, muted red. And let's also put in some Sunflower, which looks like that. It's like sunshine. And I held that pretty high so that when I pull, I could either kiss it or sort of do a full swipe. You get this beautiful, soft, gorgeous, watercolor-esque bundly, blurry, spotty deliciousness. Now there's probably some more there. So what I'm going to do is just get out another piece. Pull just a little bit more. And by the end of this, I'm working on one piece, but I should have a gazillion, I've counted, loose pieces of paper that have already been started. Remember this first bit? I spritz from high up, and this is what I get. My other option is to spritz from close up. So let's use some coffee. If I go very close, it's kind of going to flood it. You see the difference between that. Let's use honey when I spritz from high up, much more softly and gently. It's completely different. So what that means, let's do it on this. I don't know that I would normally have chosen those colors, but I am really okay with that. You get a very different effect. You see what you get? You get that. For me, what I always then do is get the brayer, and I brayer it out. It softens it up, it spreads it out, it highlights the translucency, and I actually really love that now. Look at the difference between that segment and that segment. It's add that warmth to it and that richness and dimension. So let's lean in that, people. Yeah, the brayer is a great tip. It's probably my favorite tip. So we got this, right? A lot of this looks like it's wet because it looks like the color that I use, the honey, but it's actually the paint from underneath. But let's go for it. Let's add it to the real piece. You know, there's not much left. So this is also a hint. You may not want that much. So just like when you have a stamp and you ink a stamp with an ink pad, and then it's very, very wet, you're going to get a very strong impression. And sometimes it's good to ink it off. It's the same thing. Spray on here, paint on here. Sometimes it's good just to pull on a piece and then have the ghost print, the little bit that's left, be what's on your final piece. So you get an effect like that. So let's just do a little bit more. Let's lean in heavy into these tones. So I'm going to go with the coffee, but I'm going to do it kind of from high up, nice and soft. And you know what? I think I'm going to bring in some cassis. So it's going to pick up the tone that's in there already. And we're going to soft spritz. And let's do the kissing. And even with that, I may brayer it out a little bit. What it does is it softens it up, it dries it quickly. It allows me to move to another layering element right away because I like to work fast. Don't want it too spotty. I want it to be a little bit more blendy and a little bit more spotty, but what I really, really want you to see is that as I work with these translucent layers, this just gets better and better and better. And that's what it takes to make these layers. It's patience, it's time, it's effort, it's more is more, little by little. All right, so let's just work on this, which we made earlier. And let's just go heavy with what's left. And you can see how that's added sort of a brownish, purplish tone there. And we're going to move away from the gel plate. Look at that thing of beauty. And we're going to move on to some stamping. I may surprise you a little bit with how we're going to stamp. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose some stamps here. This is one of my newer stamps from Paper Artsy and really a favorite. I'm going to just show you the set it comes from. It comes from set 42, and it's that stamp. Now, this alphabet stamp looks like that. It's attached. They're not necessarily meant to be letter stamps. You certainly can cut them up and use them another way. They're meant mostly to be for background. So what I am going to do is I am going to place them on an acrylic block, and I am going to use the dye sprays. What's that you say? Dye sprays. So I am going to go with the coffee. I'm going to use a single color first. And I'm just going to, let's take out the gel plate for a second. I'm just going to spritz down on it. You know, you can go heavy, you know, spritz close, or you can go light. And then I'm going to flip it, and I'm going to use it kind of for the background. All right, I did it upside down, so now I guess we're going this way. Now I could let that dry as is. I could help it dry. I could also use the brayer. When you use the brayer, not only does it dry, it might spread it a little bit, but it also softens it. And that's what I want. I want this to be in the background as a background. I don't want it to be in the foreground. So you see how it kind of loses itself there? And then let's do a contrast. Let's do some underwater. I might just spritz right over it so that it kind of buries it a little bit more, so it doesn't just feel like it's the top layer. Do you see how that really integrates it? So let's do a little bit more spritzing. Let's keep with the coffee, because who doesn't like coffee? I'm sort of going in different directions. Maybe I'll even go horizontal and vertical just to make this more backgroundy. And also, I haven't yet decided which direction I want this to go. So let me again lightly. I'm not doing this, people. I'm doing this nice and soft so that I just lightly integrate this with the background. You know, heavy-handed is not so good with these kinds of processes. Now, I think I'm going to take a little bit of the sunflower and spritz it on just to brighten it up a bit. And let me make mention that the darker the background, the less a light color, if it's translucent, which these are, will change it. So if the background's really dark, let's just prove my point. Doesn't it look like this would be the most gorgeous color on that? My friends, because it's translucent, you can't even see it. So the darker you get, the less likely this is going to change things. But I think it might, yeah, it's enhancing it a bit. Not going to do anything on that black, but just a little bit of brightness there. And the only way to get this much lighter and brighter is to use opaque. And if I'm going to use opaque over all these layers, I'm going to layer it out on the jelly plate like we did before, and I'm going to softly kiss the plate with the piece. Thanks. So be well, everybody. Take good care. Hope to see you soon. Bye.